What's up, YouTube? This is Russ with Wrenching with Russ. Today's segment, we're going to be working on a 2008 Ford Ranger XLT. It's a two-wheel drive. We're going to replace the front rotors. So let's get right into it. First thing you want to do is take your front wheel off. This is what we're working with. This is the front rotor. All right, let me show you what you're going to need to do this project. Here's your parts. We get everything from AutoZone. You can get them anywhere you want to. These are your bearings, and that's your seals. Here's your part numbers. It's going to be a set 5 and a set 2. And then these are your seals. The seals on these are 9150S. And this is a heavy-duty front end. For a little Ford Ranger pickup truck with a single cab, two-wheel drive, I was amazed at how heavy this front braking system is. So let's get right into it, and I'll show you how to do it. This is the brake rotor that you're going to need for the front. As you can see, it already comes with the race. Those bearings will come with a race additional, but you won't need it because if you get the same ones I got, they already have a race built in. So what I like to do is double check them and match it up with the old ones just to make sure I got the right parts before I go tearing everything apart. Now, as you can see, it's got the race in front and the back. So the first thing you want to do is you want to take this protective hub nut cap off, and it just pops off. You might have to pound on it a little bit. And inside of there we have a cotter key or a cotter pin, which I'll be taking off, show you there. Just bend it down and take the pin out. And then on the other side of that, there's going to be a little cap that fits over the nut. That helps keep it in place. And it'll just pull right off. See, right there's the cap. And then finish taking the nut off. Pretty much that's all there is to taking this off. Now you want to take your brake assembly off. First thing you're going to do is take your caliper off. Just take your bottom bolt loose. Just flip it up and just slide it out. And then set it off to the side somewhere where it don't crush your head when it falls. And then you got the bracket. There's 2 bolts in the back to hold it on there. I think they're 14 millimeter. Pull your pads out, which you can see ours are pretty worn. Take your 2 bolts out of the back. And then just slide your bracket off. Next thing you want to do is you want to pull this brake rotor off. And keep in mind that it's got the bearing in the front. So when you pull it off, you might want to hold the front of it when you slide it off there to take it out, because the bearing is going to fall out. Now the only thing that we reuse on these is going to be the washer. It's not very expensive to replace these bearings. Even if you think you don't need to, you should if you got any kind of wear on them like we do. So just slide it off, pull the old bearing out of the front, save your washer. I'm just inspecting it to see how bad it's worn. And pull the rotor off. And that's all there is to removal. Now you got all your new parts. You got your new rotor, you got your seals, you got your bearings. Next thing you want to do is you want to match it up, make sure you got the right parts. Always do a side by side. And on this one here, I pulled the old seal out of the back and the bearing. Obviously, I'm not going to reuse it, but I just want to double check and make sure I got the right parts again. There's your bearing. And I'm just checking it on the new one just to make sure it's the right size. Make sure the seal's the right size. Now with your new parts, your new bearings, your new seal, your new rotor, you set your bearing in there first. Always make sure you got your bearing in there first, because once you put the seal in, you can't put the bearing in. And you'll have to pull the seal back out, more than likely damaging it and having to replace it again. So make sure you got your bearing in there first. And we like to add some grease to that bearing when we set it in there, just to make sure that it has grease on it. And then real lightly line up that seal and tap it just till it starts to seat itself. And then we use a bearing tool, a bearing press, with a hammer, and that makes it line up nice and smooth. And you just keep slowly, methodically tapping, not real hard, but just feel the edges of it just to make sure it's seated. And if it feels like it's a little higher on one end than the other, you just can take your hammer and just lightly tap around the edges. Keep feeling just to make sure. And then when you get it in completely, you'll know because it's nice and flat. And then I always give it one little tap at the end just to make sure it's completely set. So now your seal's in there, your bearing's in there. Clean any debris off of. You don't want any debris in this. Any metal shavings, any pieces of rock or anything, it'll damage it. Slide it back on your spindle. And make sure it's all the way back where your seal sets. I'm just double checking to make sure it's up against that back of that spindle where the seal sets correctly. Once you got that, we like to take a grease gun and then fill it up full of grease. That way it's lubricated properly. And you can use whatever grease you want to use. We use a high heat. And then we pack that full. And then I'll take my finger and push that grease back in there a little better. Get any air pockets out of it. As you can see, it pushes the air back out. Now you put your front bearing in. We'll have to put grease on it also. And you set your front bearing in. And in the next step, you're going to put your washer. That's it. Again, that's the only piece that we reuse, is your washer. Set your washer on there. Replace your nut. And you're going to want to look up your torque specs on how tight to tighten this axle nut up, because each one's different. We looked ours up. So we tightened it up based on what the Ford recommendations for this particular truck is. So now you got your nut back on. We're going to torque it with a torque wrench to factory specifications. And again, you'll have to look up whatever vehicle you have, if it's a Ford Ranger, to see what the actual specs are on it, to make sure you get the right torque. So we measure this in foot-pounds. So we tighten up this axle nut. And then what you want to do, you want to keep spinning this as you tighten it down. Ours is a two-step procedure. And you want to make sure you keep spinning that. That seats those bearings in there. And now that you've got that done, final step is you're going to be putting the nut hubcap back on. So put your retainer ring in there. And then you're going to put your cotter pin back in. And again, just make sure everything lines up. Just check it to make sure that you got everything where it needs to go. Put your cotter pin back in. Then bend it over. And then on this cap, we like to put a little bit of grease in that too. Double check, make sure everything spins, nothing's hung up, spinning free like it should. Then put a little grease in the cap. And pop the cap back on. Make sure you line this up straight too, because it bends easy. Put it on by hand first, and then we take our hammer and just lightly tap around it, just make sure it seals good. And we want to check it one more time, just make sure it spins freely. And then we put the brakes back on. First thing you want to do is you want to put the caliper bracket back on. Change your hardware out for your brake pads. We put the new hardware on. Then we're going to put the caliper bracket back on. All you do is line it up, line your bolts up, and remount it. And now that you get this back on, all right, next thing you do is you want to compress the caliper pistons back. Make sure you push them all the way back, that way you can get your new brake pads on. So the next thing you want to do is you want to put your brake pads in. Sometimes these don't always line up. We got lucky and they went right in, but sometimes you actually have to grind the ends of them down because they don't always fit. Now that you got your pads in, make sure that they're up against your rotor. Make sure they're flat. And what you want to do is you want to get your caliper. And you want to put a little bit of grease on the pin so it slides like it should. And you don't have to put a lot on there, but put enough to where it's going to be effective, but you don't want to gob it on there because it's just going to all push back out. And then make sure your hose for your brake line, make sure that it's correctly positioned, because if you've got it in the wrong position, it'll kink. And then you just simply slide this back into the bracket. Now that you got your caliper back in the bracket, just slide it over your brake pads. Make sure everything's seated, and then put your bottom bolt in. Then once you get this bolt tightened up, last thing you want to do is just double check yourself, make sure everything's tight. Make sure that your rotor spins freely. Put your wheel back on. And this is the last thing that you're going to do. And that, my friends, is how you change the front rotors on a 2008 Ford XLT. It's a 2-wheel drive. And we've changed the rotors, the bearings, seal. So if you like this video, we'd appreciate if you subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video. And don't forget, why pay someone thousands of dollars when you could do it yourself?